So this morning, the session we're going to go into now is really looking at the relationships within CRO, CDMO, and the client side of the industry. And I think as we look at these relationships, we spend a lot of time putting in a lot of governance, control. We have project management. We have single point of contact, key account management. We have a lot of legal frameworks. But I think in the previous session, as somebody said, a lot of these things come down to individual relationships. At the end of the day, people do business generally with people they know, like, etc. So the relationship is key to how these relationships work. And so through today, what I want to do with the panel is really try and explore in a little bit more detail how those relationships are built, and very specifically in this industry, what are the things that work and what are the things that are a challenge to the industry moving forward. So what I propose we're going to do to start with is I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves, but as they do that, what I'd like them to do is share with the audience a couple of things that work really well in building relationships, but then also to share with everybody the things in their experience that they've found are real impediments to relationships in this sector. And so, Pedro, if you'd like to go first, and we'll start proceedings.
Buddy, thank you very much. Well, good morning, everyone. Pedro Rosado from SK Biotek, joined 4 months ago on business development, supporting business in Europe, and chemical engineer as a background. And well, I'm with the industry for quite some time, also in the business development area in Europe. And yes, well, I mean, I joined a Korean company, right? I mean, SK is the second largest group in Korea. And this actually is quite a challenge. It's quite interesting to see how relationships are important. We are here, I mean, the team in Europe, to supporting bridging the relationships between Korean and European people, which is a bit of a challenge, but maybe not so much if we compare with what's really necessary to drive business. I mean, important, I think, before all is to fulfill the expectations that we create. SK, for example, is quite known with continuous processing, particularly on the commercial scale, and this has created some reputation, which my job is really to try to fulfill it. I mean, to promote it and ultimately deliver it. The worst thing we can do is to, sometimes as a CDMO we are under pressure to change what we have agreed with our customers, having this terrible push attitude that some of our internal service providers force us to do, and it's possibly the worst thing that we can do. On the other side, I mean, making innovation your battle horse to promote yourself, trying to promote internal relationships between R&D and R&D of your customers, to bridge and to promote joint innovation projects. I mean, this is possibly the strongest way to build relationships.
Okay, thank you. Nick.
Hi, it's Nick Shackley. I'm currently with Johnson Matthey, and I've got responsibility for their contract development and manufacturing business, predominantly servicing innovators. And I've also got responsibility for the development capability that sits within Johnson Matthey, both servicing those external customers, but also servicing Johnson Matthey's internal customer, which is its own generic pipeline of development projects that we have. I think if I reflect on kind of what can work well as a service provider, really in the API space, on the drug substance area, the relationships you can build with a customer where you can really drill down and get excellent function-to-function, peer-to-peer dialogue as a natural dialogue as you work through a project, chemist to chemist, regulatory person to regulatory person, overseen by good project management. I think that allows decisions to be driven down to the right level, and by being at the right level, the decisions about changes of scope, tackling issues that arise during a development program are being made at the right place and therefore being made relatively quickly. You get good buy-in promptly when you face a challenge and it's an arising issue you've got to address and resolve and move forward with. So I think that's where I've seen success in the CDMO space. I think an area where I've seen challenge is when there really is not a good alignment and understanding between the service provider and the customer about really the degree of risk that's going to be associated with a development project. If we're facing a project that's maybe got quite immature chemistry, there's aggressive timelines being sought as people want to push, you know, the early elements of development and get into, let's say, a phase 1 clinical trial quickly. It's absolutely essential that kind of there is a mutual understanding of what the risk is and some dialogue up front about how you're going to manage that risk. If that doesn't happen, and I've seen examples where it doesn't happen, you really get into a vicious cycle of, you know, how can you drive this program faster? How can we get the timelines back on track when you're really starting from a position where you're already on your back foot? So those would be my couple of reflections on kind of what can go well and what can be more challenging as a service provider in this space.
Good morning, everybody. My name's David Molyneux. I'm the Global Head of Sales for Alcami. So we're an end-to-end CDMO, predominantly based out of the US, focused on delivery, development and manufacture of API and drug products. So the themes for me really go back to the session before. A lot of what was said there relating to the CROs I think is directly applicable to the CDMO space as well. It's all about the importance of building that relationship, of managing those relationships effectively. And the underlying principles of doing that, I think, are the same, whatever service provider you are. And that is all coming down to trust. People need to know that you are going to do what you say you're going to do. They need to believe that you're going to deliver on what they expect you to deliver in the time frame that they expected. And it's not always easy. There are lots of challenges to manage around that. And to the challenges, I would echo what Nick's just said, really. It's about managing the risk, how we look to how we best share that risk and what is fair in terms of who shoulders what part of it. But the first thing is defining it and making it available for everybody to know. If you know what you're working with, you can then start to apportion it. If you don't and you go into it blind, that's when I feel like you come into a world of hurt. So first and foremost, I think trust is the foundation on which every relationship has to be built. One of the biggest challenges we seem to face is all around timeline and risk.
David. Hi, good morning everybody. Jason Cameron, I'm VP of Supply Chain and External Manufacturing at Amicus Therapeutics. So, Amicus. So we are a biotech company, as we call ourselves, but we have products that are small molecule. So we deal with these guys and APIs and drug product through to a biologics product that is a perfusion biologics product, so not the standard fed batch, which is a very long-winded, convoluted process, and a gene therapy company. And we're quite small in the marketplace. So one of the kind of major challenges I have is working with CDMOs where there's the right fit, where we have the right voice with that CDMO. It's always a constant challenge, but I think we did a reasonably good job at that. I think that the key points that the guys up here have said is when you look for positives, is the trust, it's the right relationship manager. So entering into this as if it's a strategic partnership. And for a company like us, we have to do that. We can't really swap and change for our programs. So having the right, whether you call it a partner manager or a relationship manager who oversees the relationship, but then to the point that Nick made, really making sure that the decision making is at the right places. You don't have everything going through the relationship manager, empower the teams to interact within the right framework. That's really key for us. I think having the right fit with the company you're going to work with, whether that be cultural, whether that be your timelines. For us, it's the longevity. So one of the things we find is relationships and contracts are fairly short term, by a couple of years, 3 years, and it's always looking at where the product's going to go, whereas we're looking slightly longer term, 5, 6, 7 years, and making sure that the CDMO has that same mentality. And I guess one of the biggest problems for us when we look for CDMOs is actually technical expertise, where we have some excellent scientists who are amazing at developing products and producing products at a very early stage, but then working with CDMOs, and whether you're, we call it nation building, where we're actually training the CDMOs to work on some of the products and how that works. And that's a very different relationship, and understanding that as a CDMO that you're actually learning, I think is really, really critical.
Okay. Morning, everyone. My name is Colin, MacKay. I'm Chief Executive of Symbiosis Pharmaceutical Services. We're a specialist sterile manufacturing company. We have a facility in Scotland and an office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're very much a niche CMO. We only focus on injectable pharmaceuticals. I don't disagree with anything I've heard so far. I think a lot of these points merge together. Looking forward to an interesting session this morning. From my point of view, just to answer the question, I would say from a positive perspective, I'm a believer in starting with the end in mind, and therefore the investment of time and effort in scoping a project, whether it's short or long term, really time invested in understanding the expectations of a successful outcome is imperative. I think setting that expectation and coming at that with a very much a listening brief, so as to best understand what, as a service provider, our clients are looking for, and ensure that we can align what we can offer with what they're looking for at the end of the project, not simply what we might put on a marketing brochure. So I would emphasise that that's time well spent. From a slightly less positive perspective, I would say that the flip side of that is where there maybe is a lack of, or there's maybe too much by way of making assumptions, and assuming that there's an understanding of what a successful outcome looks like. I think those assumptions are very dangerous, and I think that's often a manifestation of, or is an example of, something else that I think is particularly negative, which is poor communication. I think that really sits at the heart of the beginning of a relationship, the beginning of a project, and if it gets off on the wrong footing, we perhaps should not be surprised if it doesn't all end up the way that we all would have liked it to have.
Okay. Thanks very much, Colin. So just picking up on some of the themes that you covered there, and continuing perhaps some of the discussion in the previous session. If we look at that front-end R&D part of the development cycle, it obviously has very specific challenges dealing with the CROs, planning clinical trials, making selections around molecules. One of the things that I think I've seen in the industry is a move to the procurement organisations, and I use that term in a general sense, being the gatekeepers of a lot of the relationships. And I think the panel here and the previous one talked a lot about the need for alignment, especially in the early stage development and R&D. And I've seen a number of models where procurement are that interface, or where the scientists are allowed to talk one-on-one in that early phase. And I'd just be interested in the panel's view and then the audience's view on how important that is in an R&D environment, and the pros and cons to those two models, because I think both exist within the industry. So I don't know, Nick, do you want to lead us off on that one, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. I think specifically, typically with larger pharma companies going down a kind of procurement organisation model, I think that model's fine as long as their role as a gatekeeper is really to set up the right framework with 1, 2, 3, however many CDMOs they kind of want to put in place as typically their favoured providers, and how they've gone through that selection and how they've aligned those providers maybe with specific technology capabilities, focusing on particular types of molecules they might want to put through. And having set that framework in place with what they would see as appropriate governance, whether it be about the economics of the deal, intellectual property and so on, is really then to get out of the way, frankly, and allow the scientists, again, with their project management teams, to really get down to the type of dialogue I referenced earlier, which is very much peer-to-peer with very coherent project management. I think if you go for a more triangular approach to communication, where it floats up to a single point or a couple of points and then back into organizations, you get slower decision making, and you can get, I think, weaker decision making, and that can also sort of get you into a vicious circle of delayed timelines and so on. So I think that model is fine as long as the respective role of the procurement organization is clear to their own organization. What value are they adding to this dialogue? And they're certainly then, having put that framework in place and appropriate governance between the two parties, is to really just let the scientists get on with the development, appropriately have visibility on how things are progressing and be able to step back in. So again, it's about governance and appropriate visibility, but not about command and control.
Colin, you're obviously exposed to the US and to the biotech community probably more than the other panel members. I'd be interested to get your view on that same question or that same hypothesis.
Yeah, it's interesting from my point of view to hear that, because Symbiosis, our target clients and the bulk of our clients are small to medium biotech clients. They're ones who are looking for a certain set of attributes around timeliness, around flexibility, responsiveness. We do work with some big pharma companies too. They come at it from a slightly different perspective. But in terms of us knowing where our strengths lie, that's the market we're trying to service. What comes out of that is a recurring direct communication. It's very rare where there's some kind of procurement intermediary trying to facilitate that. Occasionally we will do that through consultants, and we actively nurture a consultant network to help that. So Symbiosis' experience is different, and we don't see a lot of that procurement interface. What I would say on that particular point, just to slightly anecdotally, I think a lot of it will depend on the philosophy of that procurement group. Earlier in my career, I've experienced different philosophies in action from an NHS or an academic research procurement group that are very much at the transactional end of the spectrum, and they brought a very cold and very cool, certainly back in the days when I was dealing with it, approach. But at the same time, and a couple of 100 miles away, earlier in my career I spent time working for a company that used to be called Amersham. They're now part of GE Healthcare. One of the key clients that we had back in the day was AstraZeneca and their Alderley Park site. And when I think of procurement done well, I think of the guys on the ground there. They were very much at the relationship end of the spectrum, so they had a long-term philosophy, and they brought an approach to building a relationship that was not singular. I absolutely agree with the importance of people and individuals, but what they did was they looked at it more holistically and saw value in the different contact points. And I remember them sketching, the different contact points on the Amersham and the AstraZeneca side and drawing lines, and there was 15 or 16 of them. And both of those organisations had a philosophy where they wanted to nurture and develop the relationship between the individuals, but also between the organisations, so that should any of those individuals choose to move on, the relationship was still robust and fit for that purpose. So I think under procurement, if I've not gone too far off on a tangent, on the procurement side, I think it really comes, I believe it's driven by the philosophy that procurement group bring to the engagement from the outset.
Yeah. So Jason is itching to put his hand up here.
Yeah, so this is something that's close to my heart. So I was fortunate enough to work for a very large pharmaceutical company, and I headed up part of their procurement group. So this is something I've done in the past. So I think what's really important is understanding where the company is. So procurement, purchasing gets a relatively bad name, but I think you need to understand where the life cycle of that pharmaceutical or any company is. If they've gone years with no procurement or very limited maybe some site purchasing oversight, things tend to get out of control. What you end up is with relationships that are driven by scientists that aren't commercially viable, and what normally happens is you have a procurement group come down hard and they do a pro rata and they look at the top 20/80, and if you're in the 80%, you get treated a certain way. Every company goes through that, and then they move to strategic procurement. And then if you're part of the strategic procurement group, that's where they focus on the relationships, etc. And a lot of companies have gone through that. So I just wanted to say that because I think it's not, you have to understand if you're a CDMO where you sit from a company view that you're dealing with. Because it may be unfortunate that you end up in a transactional viewpoint for some of the larger pharma companies. More recently, I've worked at smaller companies and procurement. I think people who come from larger companies understand the value from a process perspective and making sure that you're doing the right checks and balances on not just getting the right dollars or the right pounds or the right euros, the value, but also making sure you've gone actually for a transparent process and you haven't ended up with the supplier that the chief science officer wanted right at the beginning. It's really important from a company kind of responsibility perspective. But that said, once that's done, what you find normally now is that that's handed off, and once that process is, then they step back and they come in at the quarterly business reviews and they check the checks and balances again. And they're normally a partner in the process. And that's how we run things at Amicus, and I think you need that structure and that rigidity, but then you need to let the people who actually do the business do the business. So I just wanted to...
No, that's a great perspective.
If I can
Pedro?
just-
Sorry, David.
Yeah, expand on that as well. I think one area that can be counterproductive to effective relationships is when procurement departments are too structured and they're too data-driven. They've got fixed KPIs in place, they have point systems for all of the suppliers and things like that. But when you're working across the development space and the commercial space and the clinical space, there are very different risk profiles depending on which product is going where. So I think it's difficult to define a complete set of metrics which fully captures and encapsulates all of those differences across the different areas of the development pipeline. So you're not comparing apples with apples when you're looking at the outputs at the end of that. So I think the dialogue can get lost if things are too structured. People forget to focus on what the individual CDMO is good at, what their niche is, and they get lost in the numbers sometimes, and that can reflect, I think, unfairly on providers, and I think ultimately it can be to the detriment of the company who are trying to get the best quality service.
Pedro?
Yes, well, I think Dave and Jason make a very important point about procurement, which I fully understand and respect. I mean, big organizations need to have a structure, need to organize and manage their requirements. But then again, as a CDMO providing services, I think we are very much keen to address directly to the ones originating the needs to come to the procurement groups. So that is the R&D. Now, it is, I mean, while it is quite easy with the Biotek to reach out directly to the R&D guy, to the formulator, or to the chemist with the need, with the large organizations, because of this environment where procurement wants to and needs to manage all this complex reality and spend, of course, involved in this. What we have seen of very good use there is to promote workshops. I mean, promote workshops on innovative services. I mean, on something where, with the support of the procurement groups, we can organize workshops at the larger organizations, be it continuous processing, be it solid dispersions. I mean, there are a number of innovative technologies where the R&D groups actually do not have most of the time the right knowledge, what's around, what's the possibility, and they really value to have a workshop, even with other customers present, to discuss problems and learn from them. So I think in this way, if the CDMOs promote this and try to work in collaboration with the procurement groups of larger organizations, reach out directly to the R&D groups through these workshops. I think we are doing as all a very good service to promote innovation, ultimately provide the patients the best solutions.
Okay, thanks. For the audience, I mean, you all work in organisations where you've experienced this sort of, the scientist to scientist, procurement as the gatekeeper, etc. I don't know if anyone has a view on that or their experience, Steve.
Yeah, well, I think it's a necessary evil, procurement. Let's put it that way. I think as Nick said.
Half the audience have left at this point.
Well, I'm going to declare my interest as a former procurement person. I'll just that. But I think what the panel haven't touched on is maybe the changing face of procurement over the last 20 years and the role we play. I mean, when I go back working for a large pharma company in procurement in the sort of mid-90s to early 2000s, we were all scientists. We were all encouraged to get out and visit suppliers, to get to know the industry, who was expert in a particular technology. So I think at that point, procurement were well placed to actively facilitate the discussions. And decisions were made in the knowledge of getting a feel for the companies involved. I think the point was made about data, and for me, procurement's become more withdrawn from the actual CDMO space. They're less familiar with the players and the people, they're less intimate with the capabilities. So their role it needs to change. If they think they can still have the same informed influence as they had 20 years ago, that's not going to be productive for them.
Sorry, there was a...
Yeah, from my perspective, I've been lucky enough to have similar roles in Jason in the past. I've headed up strategic sourcing pharmaceutical organisations, and more recently I've done some of the work that Colin referred to, which is very interesting, as an independent actually advising individuals. Fascinated by the type of the recession, the broad-minded approach, and the new words like gatekeepers and command and control. I think that there's still obviously a lot of scope there. I think that the challenge is, I think it was Jason referred to it, we can't forget it is all about relationships, it's all about communication, there's a lot of history in companies which have had mergers and acquisitions, and as both in the supply and also in the customer base. And I think that history often gets overlooked in very specific situations. And I think that's a big challenge. Big relationships, very, very complex, very multi-layered. There could be individual partners who you don't get direct contact with, which is shaping that relationship behind the scenes. So one of my questions for the panel was that they still have these perceptions of being, if you're going to have a broad-minded relationship, you have to have multiple points of contact. You can't have one point of contact. How you manage that is up to date. But one of the main, I guess, areas of communication between something like an RFP or an RFQ and the procurement department, yes. And I wonder, do the teams feel that's very much based on economics, commercial factors, or do they see scientific data? Is there, I guess, a broad conversation through those mechanisms?
So, Jason, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it depends on what you're going out for, RFP, RFQ. If it's an early stage, then I'll be very happy. We're going right through a process right now that's actually led by science. It's led by the science and the MTS group, because there is a need for really understanding what the capabilities are of the CDMOs around the world. So the whole RFI and RFP is really driven by science, and then there is a small check at the back end of that that talks about everything you would expect, like IP, talks about the economics, talks about contractual terms, but they're more as a flag. So if something comes back and there's a red flag around IP, then we get into that discussion with the right people in the room. But we've been through a process for the last month and a half with site visits, getting to know people, all driven by science. I mean, it really depends on where you are on the life cycle of a product. If you're in a phase 3 product and you want to look at expansion, you start looking at more, unfortunately, the metrics. And you start, that's driven more by your operations people. So it's really looking at the life cycle of a product and then having your procurement team partner with those teams and being knowledgeable enough knowing when they need to be leading. So if you're in a commercial product that's looking at encapsulation across multiple CMOs who can do this, then that's probably driven by procurement and you're looking at economics. If you're looking at an early stage gene therapy, an early stage biologics, you're really driven on the technical side of things. So I don't know about Andrew, but that's kind of the broad-mindedness as I think about this is just the approach of you have to understand where you want to end up, so as Colin said, and then build your teams around that and then build the right relationships.
Anyone else on the panel want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I just want to clarify my position on metrics slightly because I'm a
You're going to
scientist.
regret that forever, David.
I'm a scientist by nature and by training, and I love numbers in data. But the point that I was trying to make is we need to make sure we compare like with like always. And so if you're doing that always at phase 3, I think that's great. You know, you're always comparing people with an equal level of risk. If you're comparing a phase 3 versus, you know, early development,
do that.
exactly. That's the point that I was making. But yeah, in terms of a broad-minded approach, I don't think there's one size fits all. I think it very much depends on the size of the company, the way you're structured. I understand the necessity for formalised procurement processes and groups and departments, and I think they do have their place, and I think that they do work well. When you get down to the smaller players, and you've got guys who are wearing multiple hats, the CSO is the procurement guy, and so you naturally get involved very quickly into the detail, and they know very much what they're looking for. I think the ultimate answer is just that everybody should be aware that, you know, of what they're getting into, of what they're buying, what the capabilities are. People need to be closer to the science always, and if that's having a direct approach from scientist to scientist, quality to quality, which I think is a great approach, then that's the way to do it. Other people prefer to do that versus through the single gatekeeper. I don't think one is more broad-minded than the other. I think they're more suited and adapted to the size and scale of your business and how you choose to go out and structure it.
Yep. Yes.
This question for the panel and for the group here. Kind of on the subject of broad-minded, kind of old school is I have a kit, I have a capability, I sell the kit or the capability. At Thermo Fisher, we've done multiple situations where we didn't have the kit, or we didn't have the capability, and we built it for the client. Have you all seen that kind of, we call it a condo, have you all seen that work in your businesses and interested in the experience of the group?
Yeah, absolutely. So we always look for opportunities for co-investment. If it's something that we see a particular demand for in the market, if lots of clients are asking for it, if one client is asking for it and they can't find it anywhere else, we're always happy to work with them and see if we can make that. More often than not, it turns out not to be the most cost-effective option for the client, so not everybody goes for it, but we've seen a lot of examples in both in my current role and my previous role where you can build, you know, dedicated facilities, and particularly on the commercial side, you've got a good setup for a number of years then. So I think, yeah, building to specification is always a good thing. There are always questions around ownership and if you can use that for the clients afterwards, you know, who funds the capex, how's that paid back, all of those sorts of things need to be worked out. But it's definitely a model that is popular, I think, and continues to grow in popularity as people need more and more niche technologies, particularly on a smaller scale, because it's no longer pilot high, sell it cheap, as we all know. So yeah, as the new technologies take hold, I think we're going to see a bigger increase in that type of request for CDMOs.
Yeah, and I think, just to add to that, I mean, I think increasingly the match between what the providers have and what the clients are looking for, there's always a gap because things are becoming more differentiated, etc. I think the challenge is really the economics. I think, from a personal point of view, it has to work for both sides. So but so often these discussions are sort of, mismatched. It's, I'd like you to have a very bespoke thing, but I don't want to commit to a long-term contract, and I expect you to put the capex up. And at some point, it's just simple economics. It has to work for both parties. So I think, flexibility is great, but both parties have to come to that agreement.
But I think it is something that's becoming very much a strategic discussion now. So because if you take our company, we're a virtual company that will get into manufacturing at some point, and the condo or the joint ownership is a stepping stone towards that. But I think to have those conversations, it needs to be at a very strategic level, with kind of everybody wins or everybody loses. And I think the conversations that I personally had over the last 18 months on this is there still seems to be a slight win-lose. It's not everybody wins or everybody loses. And that's what we need to move away from, because if you're not in that win-win or lose-lose situation, it will drive you to just jump and make your own manufacturing.
Yeah.
And I think that's the strategic nature of these relationships we need to get to.
Colin, I think you...
Yeah, I would agree entirely, but I think that there's this strategic willingness to enter into a discussion about, in essence, leveraging an existing capability to make it constructive or useful for a particular client's need for maybe a singular project. The one that comes to mind for Symbiosis, whose initial vision was to be a small-scale clinical sterile fill-finish business, focusing on those biotech clients I mentioned earlier on, being approached several years ago by a company who said, could you fill a viral vector for us? And we said, we don't do that. And they said, could you fill a viral vector for us? And we said, we'll have a look at that. And we did. And what blossomed and what has developed as a relationship from that willingness to entertain it and to explore it is that Symbiosis built a physical capability, a regulatory, a quality system that supported that. And we've subsequently worked with that client over several years. We've made, I think, almost 40 batches for them. They've now taken that product to a commercial scale. We were inspected by the FDA earlier this year and are now a commercial manufacturer, albeit on a small scale. But it all really came out of that relationship willingness at the beginning to say, well, actually, we you know, Pareto style, perhaps we have 80% of what's required to service this project. And what it means is, from our perspective, is we've positioned ourselves in what's now a very hot and very rapidly expanding marketplace as someone who's been doing it for years, rather than someone who would like to get into it and start doing it. So I think, but that willingness, that's you know, openness to entertain it, and perhaps separate some organisations from others, and that's maybe where the culture and the strategy kind of interface.
Answer your question? Okay. So if we just look at the supply chain overall, I'd just like to pick up on something in the previous session. Somebody used a term that I hadn't heard before, but I think it's quite illustrative for this: impedance match between organisations. It's this idea that we get alignment. So I think there's sort of a common view in the industry that big companies like to work with big companies, and there's various alignments that are more obvious than others. I'd just maybe throw it around a little bit as a sort of contrary view, and sometimes those relationships can end up out of sync because on both sides, the provider and the buy side, size becomes leverage, which then can often be abused. And so I would sort of just challenge the panel to sort of talk about what does a healthy relationship look like, because quite often small companies end up in a relationship like a lot of things that it is not healthy and not sustainable, and vice versa, probably without even really consciously deciding one way or the other. And if we want an industry that's going to be sustainable longer term, how do we address that issue? So David, do you want to kick off?
Yeah. So for me, there's nothing worse than an abusive business relationship. I think and it does happen, the balance of power always comes into play at some point. I think for this one, what's fundamental to it is an understanding that we're a business too. The supplier side is a business too. They need to make money. They've got their shareholders. They need to make their P&L. You want to always look for efficiencies. You want to be as cost effective as possible and provide as much value as you can to all of your suppliers. But at the end of the day, you've also got a business to run, and that's a fundamental thing to understand. It comes back to me, and I've said it a lot, but I really do think it's important. It's about the risk and where the risk sits and who stands to make the most at the back end of this. So, if you've got a drug that's coming through that could potentially go big in the market, the CDMO isn't going to see the big returns from that. So is it really fair that the CDMO should bear a large portion of risk during the development? And that's where I think the abuse of power can come in sometimes, because there's always the promise of jam tomorrow and dangling the carrot of, well, this could go big, it could be commercial, it would mean more volumes for you, but the large share of that margin isn't going to the service provider, that's going to the client and to the innovator. So that's where the risk needs to be shifted. If the innovator is the bigger guy, I think that they can sometimes try to push that back onto the CDMO, which forms really quite an unhealthy relationship, and I don't think anybody comes out of that looking or feeling good.
Yeah, and I think it works both ways, because I think some of, and this is not meant to be a political statement, but I think some of the larger CDMOs also suffer from that in reverse, where the big pharma companies don't like doing business with them because they have too much leverage. So Nick, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'd just add, and this may be, excuse me, perhaps a somewhat a tactical point about how you can try and get that risk balance that you referenced, David, in the right shape. I've seen some models where there is a dialogue and there is disagreement really on what is the right balance of the economics between the two partners, particularly as you move through the later phases and into commercialization. What is this process and project going to look like year 2, 3, and 4? And the two parties are trying to lock in an economic relationship, supply relationship, in advance of knowing what some of those parameters are going to be down the road. So I think one technique I've seen being quite successful is some degree of kind of risk sharing come continuous improvement benefit sharing that really gets you in a win-win relationship between the two parties, where if there are improvements in processes, if volume drives better economics at a later stage, there's a dialogue up front that agrees how those possibilities can be structured and how those benefits can be defined and then shared. So it creates a more virtuous circle of dialogue between the two parties about both are interested in driving improvement, but both understand up front what their respective inputs to that improvement would be, whether it be some upfront capital from the customer to sort of lubricate and service additional volumes down the road, whether it be process improvements and Six Sigma applications that can drive improved productivity that would then be shared as a lower cost of goods between the two parties. So I think getting into that kind of dialogue early enough that there's a framework to see to help manage what the uncertain future looks like and balance the benefits between the two parties is a good premise to, I think, sort of get that risk discussion on the table and find the right framework for balancing that risk.
Okay, thanks. Just a quick sort of straw poll of the audience then. If we look at that dialogue, I mean, a lot of it seems very intuitive, but how many people in the audience have experienced something that isn't either a sort of open book, zero base type thing or a complete value pricing, where it's a risk and profit share deal in the sort of CRO, CDMO space? I don't need to know about but just broadly where. Okay, so I mean, there are examples out there, but it's certainly not overwhelming. So, Pedro, do you want to pick up on the question?
Well, just to complement what my colleagues were saying, I think, yes, I mean, to facilitate this communication between large organizations, both from the customer side and from the CDMO side, I mean, it is absolutely necessary to continuously align expectations at several levels of the interaction. I mean, going from the CEOs to the steering to the board members of both organizations down to the scientists, and very often it comes to the need to establish kind of a governance model. I mean, it's easier said than done, but I would recommend from early on that this communication is established, so they are established, and it promotes what is very important in this industry is the individual building of mutual trust. Right? You need to have this frequent interactions at a several level to know the people, to wine and dine with them, to align expectation, because what is for sure constant in our industry is change, and so communication, organizing these communications to a steering committee or any governance matter, what you can name it, agreeing this in front with the customer, particularly if it is a large organization on both sides, but even if it is a large on a smaller side, whenever there is a strategic interest to be more of mutual benefit, I think I have seen this of very good use to avoid obstacles. It's very easy to get obstacles on this very dynamic environment of constant challenges that we face on both sides. And the only way to, of course, I mean, it's obvious, communication is the way. The challenge is how to communicate effectively. And And yes, I mean, if you build this governance model from the start, it may be a simple one, it may grow then further, but if you establish the need to have this regular interaction, prepare yourself for these meetings, to even prepare for them for a nice dinner or a nice, event. I mean, this will help definitely. I've seen this helping a lot.
Okay, very good. Jason, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I
Interrupt.
Yeah.
I am a CDMO too, but I'm starting to feel like it's a CDMO relationship therapy section. I would invite some because this is, it's not just the broad-minded approach to big pharma relationships, it's the other way around. So can we invite perhaps some from the audience to comment on what
How they see it.
Because the point is not to have a broad-minded relationship, the point is what performance is organized in a way that you get output of, financial output, tangible output.
Yeah, no, I mean, it has to work both ways. So,
Right.
exactly.
But maybe inviting some of the audience to comment on what they are looking in a broad-minded approach.
Yeah, I'm also to the comments. So, I'm from procurement from Big Pharma, and I would really say that what we are looking at in procurement and broad-minded approach is that who is ahead of growth. That's really one thing. Because any behavior, what we have today in business, is not just based on past, but it's also based on the future. So what are we looking for? That expectation has to be clear. And from the CDMO side, it has enough confidence in terms of the performance, investment, and expectations management. If that is met, and we are also in the area of sustainability, compliance, so many things which makes a total cost of ownership, and which is beyond cost of goods. So that will be, everything, quality, and complete management of the supply chain. So if that is brought into the picture early enough, then it lays a sound base for a partnership. That could bring as well the kind of the improvement in performance and trust as well. So this is what I would look for my procurement hires.
Okay. So, I mean, anyone else on the big pharma side or in the medium? I mean, it'd be interesting to see how those relationships are viewed because it is about building a long-term sustainable partnership.
So I personally worked in, we'll call it originating pharma, not big pharma, and then generics and healthcare. But the message is clear, the message is the same. We talked about alignment, we talked about relationships. And if you're serious about the lead, if you're a big deal that gets referred to, and you're serious about the end, and if you're not having very realistic conversations about both development and manufacturing from the very beginning, just as a pharma company to return irrespective of its size, then you're not aligned. And that's a serious issue. So I asked the question earlier about the RFPs, RFPs, one of the things I'm seeing over and over again. It's great for scientists to get involved early, but when expectations are set, the emotional attachment to these programs, and then manufacturing investment and capex at the back end, and then payment needs. You have to do the hard work up front. There's no substitute for hard work. If you're not talking about development and manufacturing and the end line and the end game, you can forget your 5 to 7 year contract. And you can dispute the wage.
So, Jason, Colin, I don't know if you want to comment on that.
So I think I'm going to pick up on the point that Nick said. I think, so part of the challenge you have is, if you have whoever's involved, very early on, if you're on a CDMO and you're very early stage, the only thing you're interested in is speed. I want my product as soon as possible, and it's a relationship and costing, to be quite honest, baseline. And I think if you're not upfront very early on about what your expectations are longer term when you get into commercial and what you're prepared to pay, you end up with a world of pain. Because then the CDMO thinks, oh my God, these guys are great. They're paying through the nose for something. I'm giving them a great service. I'm doing a great job giving them everything they want. And then you start getting to near commercialization and we come along and say, yeah, but we want the cost to be half. And I think you can have, if you have that conversation at the beginning, that takes the development part throughout the process. And you've got that buying and you both know where you're going to get to. You can come up with some cost sharing through that long-term relationship. If you don't have that conversation at the beginning, both sides aren't aligned. And I think it's really important that you get that alignment really, really early on. And I agree with the point just made. The challenge you have with scientists or anybody who's involved right at the beginning is you do a great job of meeting people and building great relationships, is that those relationships can also kind of be a hindrance if things aren't going where you need it to go. because you just need to keep the cold heart of David in there as well. You need to have a business context.
Colin?
I think Symbiosis has a relatively limited service offering by design, which means that we're servicing clients that are more at the D end of R&D, preclinical, and clients who are in early clinical stages. I think in terms of trying to have that future perspective and say, okay, can we share risk or share benefits in the longer term? It's difficult to do when our industry is inherently loaded with the risk of drug failure. So that attrition rate is really difficult to manage, whether it's with regard to time or money or IP or whatever. From our perspective, I don't have a great deal to contribute on this one because we're kind of ring fenced to some extent. That our service provision is fee for service. We don't want any IP, and we don't offer IP as such. Where we hit a sweet spot is really, as Jason just said, with regards to time and the ability to offer manufacturing slots, because we understand our clients, our target clients, as I said earlier on, and they tend to be those that are smaller, very focused on time. Time is of a premium, and they have, well, it's inherently linked to the fact that they've got a cash burn and they've got a financial runway within which they need to achieve certain milestones. So we have a different risk reward relationship with our clients, where we don't get into that, what's been discussed already, that kind of risk sharing. What we do is we understand where we fit as a chunk in our clients' broader drug development Gantt chart, and we focus on being very good at it for a fee. And if we deliver a service, our intention, our ambition is for them to come back with the next drug in their pipeline. So it keeps it in that time frame in terms of the clinical development or the commercial development of the product, and distances us from some of that more product inherent risk.
It seems to me that the underlying theme, and what we all seem to agree on, is that communication early is key, and that definition of expectation from both the supplier side and the client side is really important. Everybody needs to know what they're getting into and go into that with their eyes open. And it's interesting, if I think back to the last session, one of the themes that they touched on was people, particularly some smaller players, don't know what they don't know. So, you know, to what extent do CDMOs need to take the lead in trying to drive that and make sure that the gaps are filled up front, and that the knowledge is there in terms of what needs to go in up front to de-risk further down the line. I think that's an important point to make as well.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. That's good.
Colin mentioned before about consultants, so I just wondered, because they're bridging the kind of relationship in the beginning, how does that affect you then managing that relationship going forward?
Yeah.
I can do, yeah, absolutely. I think it's almost a parallel relationship to the one we have that's direct to the client. We have a network of consultants that by their own admission have their own expertise. So they're maybe facilitating certain types of product, you know, biologics or certain types of, or they may be focused on a certain phase, or they have a specialism typically. What we understand is that they represent a funnel. They have their own network of relationships and potential clients. So we invest in helping them make their clients happy. And that, if I've just coined a new phrase, is a win-win-win. And it facilitates that whole relationship dynamic longer term. I think we have clients, most consultants have very significant experience up their sleeve, and it tends to be, in our experience, international experience as well, which gives an even broader geographical reach. And as I say, if we can manage that relationship where all three parties are happy by the end of that project, the probability of another project in the future is higher.
Okay. So I mean, I think there's some common themes from the panel. I'll come to the audience for questions. You know, that alignment and about having a common purpose, you know, is very clear. But I mean, just throw the last few minutes open to the audience. Yeah.
I guess we've heard a lot about relationships and how specific projects and transactions and how to make that work. I just wonder if there's any experience of a relationship that goes beyond that particular project. So, how does that work? And then secondly, linking to that is obviously we hear a lot about how the industry is changing and all the different things that are happening, whether it's different modalities or pace and rate of development. How does the CDMO kind of ecosystem adapt to that? How are relationships sort of critical in terms of that?
Yeah, so in terms of relationships across a single, beyond a single project, a number of our clients we work with on multiple projects and they continue to come back because of that experience and that trust that we've built. I think the relationship piece is much bigger than a single project. I think if you're just dealing on a project by project basis, it's more transactional than relationship driven. So I think by the very nature of what we're discussing encompasses multiple projects and a deeper link integrally between the client and the supplier. The second question that you had, I've forgotten, sorry.
So it's basically lots of trends and lots of the pharma industry being very different in the future.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how can these relationships, particularly on Supercom, how can they facilitate a proactive response from the CDMO, or is it all going to be you pay for the capital, you pay for the technology, or how do you think CDMOs can be?
Yeah. So my view is we've got to be on the front foot with it, talking to people about their longer plans, investing in what they're doing for the long term, and know that you're going to be part of that journey, and then you can start to plan in advance to do that together, and you can have the discussions on who funds what part of it. But it comes back to, you know, nobody's got a crystal ball, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, you just got to trust in your clients and their products and be part of that journey with them. And I think that's ultimately what a lot of our clients want and expect from us. They want us to be an extended part of their supply chain, going on the journey with them rather than separate to them.
And Nick, I mean, you're in a sector that's capital intensive. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think to build on David's point, I think scenario planning, as you look at your portfolio as a CDMO of projects and customers, whether it be single customer, single projects, or as you mentioned, you may have multiple projects with a single customer. The scenario planning about, you know, what are the timelines, what's the right investment in terms of development that they're looking for, because that will implicate, you know, what they do when, and then when they might be filing for approval, what that would then drive in terms of the state of the process at that point, and what will that then drive in terms of the asset needs for that process. So I think the key way to tackle that, again referencing the, you know, the capital intensity of the industry, whether it be small molecules, and that can certainly scale up more when you talk about biologics, would really be around that scenario planning. And how do you balance a portfolio, how does a CDMO balance a portfolio of projects against its own planning for CapEx investment, and what might get outside, you might say, a reasonable comfort zone that would say we've got to get into more of a risk balance with dialogue with a client, as opposed to we've got enough of a portfolio that we can inherently take this risk. So I think that scenario planning piece is a key one to inform when you're going to go to clients and talk about any sort of co-investment on CapEx.
Does anyone in the audience on the buy side have a view that's different to that in terms of, you know, where that risk share and sharing of investment should be? I'd be interested to get some feedback the other way. No. So it's probably going to be one of those challenges that the industry still has to grapple with. So I think, are there any other questions today from the audience on the panel discussion? Yeah.
Just one question really, trust about maybe not too much to Jason, but then flipping it around to Jason's comments was putting the customer back into the centre here. We have talked a lot about CDMOs today. I want to put the customer at the forefront. And I'd like to know from, you know, the service providers on the panel, what's the primary behaviour that you do every day that you think makes a difference to your client's relationship? And then flip that to Jason is, what does he see as his primary need or behavioural need from a service provider? It may all be the same, but I'm just interested if there's one primary thing you do every day.
I just put it down as communication at a project level. It sounds boring, but it's fundamental, and that's the key. If that isn't happening, and issues aren't getting addressed properly and there isn't the transparency, it'll go off the rails.
Yeah, I would echo that from Nick, but also I would add reactivity and proactivity, being flexible, and we deal with a lot of small, mid-sized pharma predominantly, and flexibility is key in an uncertain world. I think that's one of the biggest things that we bring to keep them on their goal.
Yeah. I would just emphasize the communication aspect, particularly with large pharma, because large pharma has challenges with communicating, even internally. So it has also very, very, very strong, very difficult challenges to communicating with their service providers. So this is absolutely key, as we all spoke today, to facilitate the interaction between both parties.
Colin?
I would take it back to the point I made at the very beginning about starting with the end in mind and asking the client before you embark on the project, what's most important to you? What are your expectations around this? And with regards to communication specifically, absolutely. How often do you want to hear from us? And through which channel? What do you want? And then make sure we do it every day.
If we look at the broad-minded approach and relationship from what I'm hearing so far, is it more time to rename the CDMO definition with a start with contract? And I think what I've heard from the panel is that perhaps that is not the best way to define a relationship. Maybe communication or consultative is words that I've heard from you.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a topic for a future panel. But on a very personal, I think that's very true. I mean, this is an industry that is built inherently on long-term relationships because the product life cycle is long. We all know how this sector works, that people move between companies and providers and whatever else. People have been on both sides, but if there isn't that long-term view of a more collaborative nature, where it's win-win-win, as Colin said, then, I think that the industry is going to struggle. Sorry, Jason, do you want to bring us home?
Well, I guess the one thing that we look for is for the CDMOs not to sugarcoat anything. I think that too often information and communication is sanitized, and that's not what we want. That's not an open relationship, and that goes two ways. So if we're not doing things right, we need to be told we're not doing things right. If we're a pain in the arse, we need to be told we're a pain in the arse. If you guys are screwed up, you need to tell us. I think if you get to that open transparency, not sugarcoated, then you have the right relationship. If you haven't got that, you don't have the right relationship.
Can I just say I was going to say that?
But I think that is, just to wrap up, I think that's true. I mean, we've heard a lot about relationships and everything else, but whether it be in this industry or others, at the end of the day, the most difficult thing to manage is surprises. The financial markets dislike it, everybody dislikes that, and so we all have stakeholders, and so having that openness that nobody gets surprised, I think, is a key, and it probably goes to the point about building relationships rather than just transactional interactions. So thanks to the panel and thanks to the audience.